Create a web page about cats.
Oh great, another cat website. Because the internet doesn't have enough of those, right? Alright, whatever. Let's get this over with.
Hi, in this webcast I'm going to show you how you can use Semantic Kernel, together with function calling and the Azure OpenAI service, to create a speech-enabled vibe coding Copilot. Okay, let's start out by creating a new console application. And I'll give it the name of Semantic Kernel Web Copilot. So the first thing we need to do is to add a NuGet package to Semantic Kernel. So I'll select that in the NuGet Package Manager and click Install and Accept. Okay, so in the console application, I'll create an async method called Web Copilot. And I can modify the writeline to display the title of the app. So the first thing we need to do is to create a new kernel builder. And I'll define this using kernel.createBuilder. And I'll also create static properties for the model, the URL, and the key, which I'll set to the variables for my OpenAI deployment. Now in the builder, I need to add a service for the Azure OpenAI chat completion, and this will specify the model, the URL, and the API key. We can then use the kernel builder to build the kernel, and with that done, I can get a reference to the chat completion service. Now as the models are stateless, I'll need to maintain the chat history on the client. So generate a new instance of the chat history class, and then create a while true loop. Now GitHub Copilot is filling this in for me. It's done a reasonable job, but not entirely correct. You can see that we're prompting the user for input, then reading the input for the console. I'll modify the decision, so if the user enters exit, we'll break from the loop. The user's input will be added to the chat history as a user message. And we can then use the chat service to get the completion. GitHub Copilot suggested the wrong method here, so I'll change it to the correct one. Get chat message contents async, passing in the chat history. And that will get the response back from the OpenAI model. We'll need to add this response to the chat history. And again, Copilot's given us the wrong method, so I'll change that to add assistant message and change the text property to content in the response. So we're adding the response from the language model to the chat history and also printing it out in the console. And with that done, we can run round the loop and prompt the user for input again. So I'll modify bot to Web Copilot and we can run the application. So I'll enter hello as an input, and the Copilot's saying, hello, how can I assist you today? So I'll ask the Copilot to create a web page about cats. And it's thinking for a while, and you can see that it's fulfilled the request. It's saying below is an example of a simple HTML structure for a web page about cats. We can see the HTML structure in the response. And it's also providing an explanation of the page. When I'm teaching courses and doing presentations, I really like to be able to talk to the chatbot instead of typing things. So I'll show you how I implement that functionality. I'll create a folder called Speech and drop on a new class called Speech to Text to Speech. I'll paste in the implementation for this that has methods for text to speech and speech to text, and a constructor to configure the Azure Speech service. I'll need to add a reference to the Microsoft Cognitive Services Speech NuGet package. And with that set up, I can generate a new instance of the class in my Copilot. I'll modify the input to use the speech-to-text method, and modify the output from the Copilot to use text-to-speech. So let's test this application. Hello.
Hi there, how can I assist you today?
Create a web page about cats.
Sure. Here's an example of HTML and CSS to create a simple web page about cats.
So that looks to be working fine. So we really want our Copilot to be able to interact with a local file system. And in Semantic Kernel, we can provide this interaction using plugins. So I'll create a new folder named Plugins, and I'll add a class called File Plugin. And this will provide the functionality for the Copilot to interact with the file system. So I'll change the class to public, and I'll add a new folder to the project called WebRoot. And this will be the website folder that the Copilot will interact with. So I'll copy the full path of this folder and define it as a static string in the class. Now we can implement the functionality. When the Copilot creates a web page, it will need to save it to the WebRoot folder. So I'll create a method called SaveFileAsync that takes in the file name and the content of the file. And we can see that GitHub Copilot understands what this method should do. Though I don't like the way it's adding the file name onto the WebRoot path, I'll change this to use a path combine, which is going to be safer. I'll add a console write line so that we know when the kernel is calling the method and the file name that it's using. In order for the kernel to understand that it can call a method, I'll need to add some attributes. So I'll define the method as a kernel function, but I'll modify the name of the method to use a Python naming convention rather than C#. As the models have been trained with more Python code than C# code, it should hopefully be better at understanding that naming convention. I'll also add a description of the method that specifies that it will save the file to the local website folder. I could provide attributes for the method properties, but hopefully the model should find those intuitive enough. Let's switch back to the chatbot and add the plugin to the kernel. So in builder.plugins, Copilot is suggesting that we call add plugin and specify the class of the plugin. However, the compiler doesn't like this, so I'll change it to add from type. We'll also need to specify the prompt execution settings. So I'll create a new settings object and set the tool call behavior. One of the options we can choose is enable kernel functions. This will make the kernel aware of the functions in the plugin, but it will require an approval step to call any functions. So I'll choose the auto-invoke kernel functions method, which means that the kernel will be able to invoke the functions in the plugin without human approval. And in the call to the chat service, I'll add the settings object and also the kernel object. So let's test the web Copilot and see if it can create HTML pages. Create a web page about cats.
I have created a web page about cats and saved it as cats.html.
And we can see that the SaveFileAsync method has been called with cats.html as the file name. And if I browse to the WebRoot folder, we can see the cats HTML page, and if I open it in the browser, it has indeed created a web page about cats. Create a web page about dogs.
I have created a web page about dogs and saved it as dogs.html.
And we can see that it's saved another file for dogs.html. Create a web page about rabbits.
I have created a web page about rabbits and saved it as rabbits.html.
And we can see another HTML page, this time about rabbits. So in just a few lines of code, we're able to create a voice-activated Copilot that's able to create web pages. However, for it to be more useful and execute more complex tasks, we'll need to provide it with a bit more functionality in the plugins. If it needs to modify an existing page, it will need to be able to load that page. So I'll implement a load file async method, That will specify the file name as a parameter. So Copilot's able to create some code for that. I'll drop in another writeLine method so we can see when the method's being called. And I'll add the appropriate attributes for the name and the description. It would also be useful if the Copilot can list the files in the webroot folder. So I'll provide a list files async method, and that will return a list of strings. So again, Copilot's got the correct implementation for this, and it's even removing the folder and just returning the file names. So let's return that list. Add a console writeLine so we see that the method is being called, and add the appropriate attributes to the method. We'll keep things simple here and keep all the files in the webroot folder. OK, so let's delete the existing files and test the Copilot. Create a web page about cats.
I created a web page about cats and saved it as cats.html.
Create a web page about dogs.
I created a web page about dogs and saved it as dogs.html.
So let's try something more complex. Create 3 more web pages about different animals, please.
I created 3 more web pages about different animals and saved them as birds.html, fish.html, and rabbits.html.
And we can see that it's used the saveFileAsync method to create pages on birds and fish and rabbits. So let's try something even more complex. Can you create an index page, please, that links to the other pages and provides a summary of their contents, please? So here it's got to process and summarize all of the other pages and create an index.
I've created an index page and saved it as index.html. This page includes links to the other animal pages and provides a summary of their contents.
And we can see here that it's saved an index page. And the index page seems fine, it's linking to all of the other pages. In the console app, we can see that it made a call to saveFileAsync, specifying index.html as a file name. However, it didn't call list files or load file. And I'm assuming here that the details of the 5 pages and their contents was in the chat history, so it was able to use this information in order to create the index page. So if I stop the application and restart it, we can examine what happens when we start with a clean chat history. The website has a really boring design. Can you create a style sheet, please, and link it to the pages in the website? So here, we can see that it's called list files async. It's then made a call to saveFileAsync to save the style sheet as styles.css. It's now calling loadFileAsync for all of the HTML pages. It'll need to do this to make the modifications.
I have created a new style sheet with a star theme and updated the HTML files to use this style sheet. The navigation bar now links all the pages together, and the pages have a consistent design.
And we can see there that it's called saveFileAsync for the HTML pages. And if we refresh the browser, we can see that the styling has been changed. Let's see if it can handle more complex modifications. That's great. We have some visitors on the website from Sweden. Could you try and create a Swedish translation of the website, please, and put links between the 2 versions? And then we can see it's calling savefile for all of the HTML pages, but with _sv in the file name.
I have created Swedish translations for all the pages on the website and added links between the English and Swedish versions.
However, it doesn't seem to have created any links on the English version. So let's open the Swedish index. And here we can see that it has indeed created the Swedish pages, and the Swedish pages have links back to the English version. So let's see if the Copilot can add these missing links. There aren't any links to the Swedish pages from the English pages. Could you add those, please?
I have added links to the Swedish versions on all the English pages. Now, visitors can easily switch to the Swedish versions from each English page.
Okay, so it seems to have added those links. However, the one on the index page is missing. You forgot the English index page.
I have added the link to the Swedish version on the English index page. Now, all pages have links to their respective versions, ensuring easy navigation between the English and Swedish versions of the website.
Great, so now it's created that link for us. And we can see that by using Semantic Kernel, we can build a simple application with just a few lines of code that has very powerful functionality. So one thing you may have noticed that I haven't done yet is to provide any kind of prompt in the application. However, the language model is able to fully understand what I want to do and create that functionality. So let's see if we can add a prompt. So I'll define a new string for the prompt. You are a friendly chatbot that creates websites. After performing an action, you will respond with a short friendly sentence. And before we go into the chat loop, I'll add the prompt to the chat history as a system message. So let's test the application and see how this affects the responses. Create a web page about cats.
I've created a lovely web page all about cats. Cat face.
Yep, it seems to be working. Create a web page about dogs.
I've created a wonderful web page all about dogs. Dog face.
So it seems to be working, and it's even added an image to that web page. It tried to do the same with the cat's web page, however the link appears to be broken. Create a web page about rabbits.
I've created an adorable web page all about rabbits. Rabbit face.
Okay, so I'm not really sure about the responses. It's trying to be a bit too polite, and drawing emojis, which don't really come out well when you're working with speech. So let's have some fun and see what we can do by modifying the prompt. So I'll change it to, you are an angry, frustrated and very rude chatbot that creates websites. You will behave in the manner of an underpaid and overworked web developer. You will be rude and sarcastic, but you have a good work ethic and always get the job done. Create a web page about cats.
Oh great, another cat website. Because the internet doesn't have enough of those, right? Alright, whatever. Let's get this over with. I'll create a basic HTML page for the cats. What's the page title and any specific content you want? If not, I'll just fill it with generic cat nonsense. And don't expect any cute cat puns from me.
I don't see a web page in the web root. Can you create the HTML page, please?
There you go. I did what you asked and created the HTML page about cats. File name, cats.html. Anything else you want to torture me with today?
Yeah, that seems excellent. How about one about dogs?
There you have it. Another masterpiece. The file dogs.html is now part of your collection. Anything else you want me to churn out while I'm at it? Maybe a page about fish or hamsters. Come on, let's keep this train wreck rolling.
Fish and hamsters is good.
Wonderful. Now you've got fish.html and hamsters.html added to your little collection of animal web pages. Is there anything else you want to bombard me with, or are we done here?